Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Salman Sheikh from Best Cloud Prep. This is the application summary lecture for Solutions Architect Associate exam. So we are going to start with the SQS. SQS is a way to decouple your infrastructure. So we use the example of a travel website or meme website. Basically, you store your messages in SQS and your EC2 instances will go get those messages and go ahead and do something. If those EC2 instances somehow stop working, the message will then reappear in the queue and then another EC2 instance will go in and get it. Then that way, if anything fails, it doesn't break your entire application stack. Remember that SQS is pull paste and not push paste. If you want push paste messaging, you are going to use SNS. Messages are 256 kilobytes in size. You can actually have them bigger, but it won't be stored in SQS. It will be stored in S3. And messages can be kept in the queue from 1 minute to 14 days. And the default retention period is 4 days. And then just remember the two different types of SQS. So we've got standard SQS and we've got FIFO SQS. You have to understand the different use cases for them. So standard order is not guaranteed and message can be delivered more than once. However, with FIFO, order is strictly maintained and messages are delivered only once. So really, remember that going into your exam. Remember the difference between standard and FIFO. Also remember the visibility timeout. This is the amount of time that the message is invisible in the SQS queue after a reader picks up a message. Provided the job is processed before the visibility timeout expires, the message will then be deleted from the queue. If the job is not processed within that time, the message will become visible again and another reader will process it. This could result in the same message being delivered twice. So remember this is very important. So if you are getting the same message being delivered twice and this is the root cause, you may want to increase your visibility timeout. Just to give your EC2 instances that little bit of extra time to process the message. And finally, just remember that the visibility timeout maximum is 12 hours. Also remember that SQS guarantees that your messages will be processed at least once. And then long polling is a way to retrieve messages from your Amazon SQS queues, while the regular short polling returns immediately, even if the message queue being polled is empty. Long polling doesn't return a response until a message arrives in the message queue or the long poll times out. And this is a way of saving money with SQS. Moving on to SWF. So you just need to understand the difference between SQS and SWF. SQS has a retention period of 14 days. With SWF, that is simple workflow service, executions can last up to 1 year. And also SWF presents a task-oriented API, whereas SQS offers a message-oriented API. So if you've got a scenario-based question talking about a task-based structure, and maybe it's got human workers, for example, then you want simple workflow. If you're talking about a message-based system, then you're going to go after SQS. Remember that SWF ensures that a task is assigned only once and is never duplicated. With SQS, on the other hand, you need to handle duplicated messages if you're using the standard one. Obviously, if you're not using FIFO, then you'll have to manage duplicated messages. And then SWF keeps track of all tasks and events in an application. With SQS, you need to implement your own application level tracking, especially if your application has multiple queues. So remember this. Then we learned a little bit about SWF, so simple workflow actors. So we have workflow starters. These are applications that initiate or start a workflow. Could be your e-commerce website following the placement of an order, or a mobile app searching for bus times. Then we have our deciders. These basically control activity tasks in the workflow execution. And if something is finished or failed in a workflow, a decider then decides what to do next. Simple. And then we have our activity workers. And these are basically people or programs or applications that carry out activity tasks. If you see anything about a human working in a warehouse and you need a way of managing it, then think of simple workflow service. As you might know, Amazon.com use simple workflow to help run their warehouses. Moving on to SNS, just remember what it is and the different benefits that it gives you. So it's push-based delivery system. So there is no polling like with SQS, obviously. If you're getting pull-based, you're going to go for SQS. If you're getting push-based, you're going to go for SNS. So remember this. SNS gives you a simple API and easy integration with applications. You get flexible message delivery over multiple transport protocols. It's inexpensive, pay-as-you-go model with no upfront costs. Its web-based AWS management console offers the simplicity of a point-and-click interface, and then, just like I said before, SNS versus SQS, both messaging services in AWS. SNS is push and SQS is pull or pull. So remember this difference. SNS push, SQS pull, pull. Moving on to Elastic Transcoder. It is really simple. Just remember that it's a media transcoder in the cloud. It converts your media files from their original source format into different formats that will play on smartphones, tablets, PCs, etc. Then comes API Gateway. So just remember what it is at a high level. It's basically a gateway into your AWS resources or your AWS infrastructure. It has a caching capability to increase performance. It's low cost and scales automatically. That being said, you can throttle API Gateway to prevent attacks, and you can log your results to CloudWatch using API Gateway. And then, if you're using JavaScript or Ajax that uses multiple domains with API Gateway, you have to ensure that you have enabled CORS on your API Gateway. This is very important. Make sure you have enabled CORS. CORS is cross-origin resource sharing. And remember that CORS is always enforced by the client's browser. So remember this. Now moving on to Kinesis. Just remember the difference between Kinesis Streams and Kinesis Firehose. Kinesis Streams has data persistence. It's going to store your data by default for 24 hours, but can go up to a longer period of time. So you get your data persistence. And then you have your EC2 instances going in and getting the data from the streams. Whereas on the other hand, Kinesis Firehose is where you need to analyze your data in real time and then find a place to store it, because there is no persistence. You could have Lambda functions running in Firehose that then store that data into S3, or they could put it into Elasticsearch clusters, etc., etc. So if you see anything mentioning about shards or about data persistence, you want streams. If you want real-time analytics and then a place to put it instantly with no data persistence, then you're going to be using Firehose. And you're going to be given scenario-based questions where you must choose the most relevant service, and then you have Kinesis. And finally, you have Kinesis Analytics, which basically helps you analyze your data in both Firehose as well as Kinesis Streams. And then finally, let's look at Cognito. So Cognito allows us to do web identity federation. So federation essentially allows users to authenticate with web identity providers such as Google, Facebook, and Amazon. And essentially the way it works is the user authenticates first with the web ID provider and receives an authentication token, which is then exchanged for temporary AWS credentials, allowing them to assume an IAM role. Incognito is an identity broker which handles the interaction between your applications and the web ID providers. You don't need to go ahead and write your own code for this. And then the main thing to remember for Cognito is the difference between our user pools. So our user pools are user-based, and they handle things like user registration, authentication, and account recovery, etc. Whereas identity pools authorize access to our AWS resources. So that is it for this section of the course, guys. You've done really well. Hopefully you've learned a lot through this summary, and hope to see you in the next lecture. And finally, I would like to acknowledge and thank Kronenberg Brothers from A Cloud Guru platform. If you have the funds and time, please visit their website and learn from the gurus of cloud computing. Thank you, and hope to see you in the next lecture.